What if I told you that the story of biblical history carried across centuries might be missing its deepest bones, that the narrative passed from pulpit to household table could be overlooking the very foundations of identity, inheritance, and divine purpose? That the truth about the ancient covenant people was scattered like embers across enemy territory, while the world was taught to bow before a carefully crafted illusion? What if the faith you inherited was built on fragments, while the full structure waited beneath layers of dust and design? Then hear me, for the path before us is not the path of comfort, but the path of unveiling. Imagine standing at the threshold of a forgotten gate, a place where memory and prophecy converge, where the whisper of ancient testimony rises from the soil itself, calling you to step beyond the soft stories of tradition and into the battlefield of truth. This is where the journey begins. Not with certainty, but with a question that cuts deeper than sword or flame. What if the Israelites you were shown were not the Israelites the scriptures described? What if the images carved into your imagination were not echoes of divine revelation, but weapons forged to sever millions from their birthright? The book of truth, preserved in the living testimony of the oppressed and the dispersed, claims to fill in the gaps, revealing lost inheritances, buried histories, and the suppressed chapters that flesh out the body of Scripture. But here is the turn that shakes the ground beneath us. These truths were exiled from the mainstream, pushed outside the comfortable walls of accepted narrative. Why? Who gained from silencing them, who benefited from a world where the covenant people were remade in a different image. Today we unseal a forbidden archive, a hidden ledger etched into time, and we step inside with the resolve of those who refuse to bow before deception. In this unfolding, you will not hear dry doctrine or the stale dust of old arguments. You will hear the tremor of awakening, the sound of identity, returning like a storm, gathering its strength. For this is not merely a study, it is a march into contested territory. We trace the roots, the wanderings, the exiles, the erasures, and the recoveries. We follow the thread from scripture to soil, from prophecy to lived reality, from the ancient words to the modern struggle for truth. And in this tracing, something awakens. Something older than memory, yet rising anew in this generation. As I speak, I remember the vision of wandering through a vast valley, dim with twilight, where the shadows of forgotten nations lingered like smoke. And in the silence a voice said, "Look closely, for not all who are forgotten are lost." I saw a people walking through centuries of storms, carrying an inheritance. Others tried to bury, but the inheritance burned like a coal that could not be extinguished. Their story was not absent, merely hidden, waiting for those willing to lift the veil. So hear this. The journey you are about to enter is not for the faint of heart. It demands the courage to question, the discipline to discern, and the fire to confront the strongholds that shape the faith handed to you. But if you endure to the end, the reward is clarity, the recovery of truth, and the restoration of a heritage stolen but never destroyed. Let us begin with the first revelation, the fracture between the image you were given and the image the scriptures actually bear. A fracture that once seen cannot be unseen. Shadows shift when the truth of a face long hidden begins to rise, and the first thing that surfaces is the quiet but unbreakable testimony of Scripture itself. The descriptions are not subtle and not poetic metaphors meant to be softened by later imagination. They speak of skin darkened like the tents of desert wanderers, of features shaped by the relentless sun of the ancient Near East, of people who belonged unmistakably to the lands that bordered Africa, breathed Africa, and intermarried with Africa. These details stand firm even when centuries of art attempted to bury them beneath brighter shades. The Shulamite woman in the ancient song speaks of her skin as dark as the tents of Kedar. The lament of a devastated people describes visages blacker than coal. The daughters of Midian mistake Moses for an Egyptian, not because of clothing alone, but because his appearance and complexion matched the people who lived along the Nile. Every detail testifies that the covenant people walked in the tones of earth and sun, not in the pale hue later painters imagined. But there came a time when the paintbrush became a weapon. It did not strike with force, but with slow corrosion, changing the recognizable into the unfamiliar. When empires rose and wanted their faith to reflect their own image, they reshaped the faces of prophets and patriarchs to resemble those who held power rather than those who actually carried the covenant. In this slow and deliberate shift, the story of Israel was stripped of its original color and remolded into a reflection of those who conquered lands, not those who wandered deserts under a burning sky. The change did not happen in a moment. It crept across centuries like a fog that thickens until people no longer remember what the landscape looked like before it settled. Painters carved out features that matched Rome instead of Jerusalem, Florence instead of Judea. Slowly the world was taught to see pale prophets, pale kings, pale disciples, until the imagination of entire nations bowed before an image that never existed. And in this quiet erasure lay a deeper strategy. When you sever a people from their true reflection, you weaken their claim to their own story. When you repaint their ancestors, you repaint their sense of belonging. This is why the war over image is more than artistic debate. It is spiritual warfare. The enemy does not always destroy truth with violence. Sometimes he replaces it with a gentler image and waits for memory to fade. As I looked upon this history, I saw a man in the modern age sitting beneath a dim lamp, reading passages he had overlooked for years. He saw the Shulamite speak of her deep complexion. He saw Moses mistaken for an Egyptian. He saw lamentations of skin dark as the oven heat. And his breath caught because he realized the faces in Scripture looked more like him than the pale figures in the stained glass above the sanctuary of his childhood. This revelation did not inflate pride, but awakened recognition. It was as if the pages had been waiting for him to see what had always been written. I saw another vision, a gallery of ancient mosaics scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, faces of prophets etched in stone with deep browns and desert bronze, worshippers with curled hair, strong features, and the unmistakable appearance of people shaped by Africa and the Near Eastern sun. These mosaics did not argue, they simply testified. They bore witness that the portrayal given by later European paintings was not a recovery of ancient truth, but a replacement. Scholars uncovered carvings in synagogues where figures carried the tones of the soil, not the pale tints, later pushed across continents. These remnants stood like silent soldiers on a forgotten battlefield, holding their line against centuries of revision. And behind all of this rose a darker truth. The removal of the original image was not only aesthetic, it was political, cultural, and spiritual. If the covenant people appeared undeniably connected to Africa, then the narrative used to justify domination and enslavement would fall apart. So a new image was constructed an image that served empire rather than scripture. But what has been hidden begins to stir when the authentic face rises again. It does not come as a gentle whisper, but as a trumpet blast. It calls scattered hearts to remember what was lost. It shakes illusions painted by men and restores what was written by the breath of God. Identity is a fortress. When recovered, it strengthens the spirit, awakens courage, and calls the soul to rise. I saw warriors forming, not with weapons of steel, but with a clarity of truth. Each fragment of scripture reclaimed, each ancient mosaic recognized, each buried description restored, became a blade in their hands. The enemy trembles not because a face is dark or light, but because truth shatters the chains of deception. And now a question must be asked, not lightly, but with the weight of centuries pressing behind it. Do you feel something stirring as this truth unfolds? Do you sense the veil thinning, the recognition rising, the bond between scripture and identity tightening inside you? If your spirit has felt even a whisper of awakening, then I thank you. Thank you for listening with courage, for remaining present as forgotten truth returns to its rightful ground. Your willingness to hear is itself an act of warfare against the silence that once tried to bury these revelations. The weight of ancient warning settles on the earth like a heavy mist. When the prophecy of Deuteronomy begins to pulse beneath the surface of history, for the words carved into that chapter were not idle threats, but the architecture of consequences spoken long before any empire laid its iron roads across the seas. The line about returning to Egypt with ships carries a quiet terror, because Egypt in that passage is not a location but a condition. A return to bondage, descent into chains, a repetition of suffering that had once been escaped. When I traced that prophecy across centuries, the vision rose with dreadful precision, ships emerging through the fog, wooden beasts with bellies full of sorrow, carrying people who never imagined that their own footsteps would echo the lamentations spoken by Moses. The prophecy unfolded not like a metaphor, but like a blueprint. People taken from their villages under the weight of night, forced into the darkness of hulls where the air became a furnace of fear, carried across waters that swallowed the cries of families torn apart. Each detail aligned with the ancient warning, as if history itself had been pulled into the orbit of divine consequence. Egypt again, with ships, not the pyramids, not the Nile, but the bondage that once defined the nation and would again mark a scattered people whose identity the world would later try to erase. When I looked closer, I saw something deeper stirring beneath the cruelty. The faces of those chained bore the features of ancient lands where Israel once walked, skin shaped by desert sun. Features echoing the regions where the covenant stories first unfolded. Their songs, though broken, carried the rhythm of ancient laments. Their prayers whispered in the darkness bore the cadence of psalms long forgotten by the world, but remembered in the marrow of their suffering. These were not coincidences. They were threads strong enough to tie exile to prophecy, suffering to scripture, scattering to the ancient pattern that defined Israel's path. The enemy who sought to break their bodies did not know he was echoing the pattern of Israel's dispersions, did not know his violence was tracing the lines Moses had warned of. We did not know he was fulfilling a prophecy older than his own empire. The deeper I walked into this vision, the more clearly I saw the region once called Cush, stretching across the upper Nile like a dark river of heritage. Cush, whose people are mentioned repeatedly in Scripture, not as outsiders, but as neighbors. allies, warriors, and even spouses of those in the covenant line. Moses married a Cushite woman, and when prejudice rose against her, the Lord himself defended the union, rebuking those who dared judge what he had blessed. The people of Cush were woven into the story of Israel through marriage, migration, friendship, and bloodline. Their features, their skin tones, their cultures stood close to those of Israel, not distant, not foreign, not separated by complexion or geography. I saw in this an undeniable truth. The peoples of northeastern Africa and the ancient Israelites shared more than borders. They shared inheritance, memory, custom. Yet centuries later, the world would pretend those lines never crossed. Empires rose and wanted a version of Israel that looked like themselves. So they separated Israel from Africa in the minds of the nations. Even though the scripture refused such division, as the vision deepened, I was carried to a village on the western coast of Africa just before dusk. Children running, elders speaking under the trees, mothers singing melodies older than their own names. When raiders arrived, the peace shattered like clay struck by a hammer. Families were dragged toward the shoreline, bound in lines like sacrificial offering. Yet one detail pierced through the chaos. An elder, trembling as he walked, whispered blessings over the children. His words rose with a cadence that felt ancient, words that mirrored prayers of protection once spoken by patriarchs in the early pages of Scripture. He did not know the depth of the heritage he carried. He did not know that the language of his blessing traced the same patterns found in tongues spoken by ancestors of Israel. Heaven knew, heaven recorded the blessing, the lament, the scattering. Heaven recognized what the world would one day deny. The ship that carried them away became an altar of suffering, yet also a vessel of prophecy. In the darkness of the hull, I saw a mother humming a melody that rose like smoke. Her voice carried not despair alone, but defiance, a declaration that her spirit would not be broken, even if her body was claimed by chains. That song echoed like an unfinished psalm, part lament, part prophecy, part Wallfahre. It was the sound of a people bound in flesh but unbroken in identity. As the ship drifted farther from home, the line of Deuteronomy glowed like fire across the sky. Egypt again, with ships. The prophecy did not end there. It spoke of scattering across nations, of people becoming strangers in lands that did not know their names, of suffering that would carve valleys in their memory. But it also whispered of restoration, of gathering, of recognition returning in the appointed time. Prophecy carries its own heartbeat, and I felt it pulsing across generations. Those taken did not know they were fulfilling ancient warnings. Those who enslaved did not know they were reenacting a story far older than their greed. But heaven knew, and the soil of history retained the imprint. What was scattered would one day awaken. What was broken would one day rise. The chains forged in darkness could not silence the truth written long before the chains existed. The God who warned of exile is also the God who promises return. And now the echoes of that return begin to stir beneath the surface of our age, calling identity back from the depths, summoning truth from the shadows, lifting the forgotten into the light of remembrance. Voices echo across the ancient tongue when the trail of language begins to reveal what history tried to bury. For language carries memory like a vessel carved to endure storms. And when the vessel breaks open, the truth spills across generations with the force of a forgotten river. The Hebrew tongue did not stand alone in the world of antiquity. It belonged to a family of languages that were born from the same soil, the same breath, the same ancient pulse that shaped northeastern Africa. The patterns of its sounds, the structure of its roots, the cadence of its prayers, all pointed not toward distant European shores, but toward the land stretching from the Nile to the Horn of Africa, moving through deserts and mountains where the sun shaped both people and speech. When I listened closely, I heard a rhythm that repeated itself in languages scattered across Africa. A rhythm not learned from missionaries or traders, but carried in the bones of entire peoples long before foreign ships touched their shores. The same root structures appeared in Amharic, in the tongues of Cush. In the Berber lines of the northern sands, even farther west, echoes rose in languages separated by thousands of miles, as if fragments of an older linguistic fire had been carried by the wind of exile. Among the Yoruba, I heard words for sacred days that shared the structure of ancient Hebrew. Among the Igbo, I found rites and blessings that mirrored the laws given in the earliest pages of Scripture. The sound of Shabbat walked among their traditions. The rhythm of circumcision on the 8th day breathed within their customs. The pattern of ritual purity and dietary boundaries lived among them like an unbroken thread. These were not imitation. They were footprints of a people scattered long before maps were drawn, long before borders were claimed by empire, long before scholars argued over what belonged to whom. In the hidden corridors of this linguistic realm, I found the outlines of a story etched like a faint constellation. When a people are scattered, they often lose lands, temples, records, and monuments, yet language survives inside them even when everything else is taken. It clings to lullabies, to rituals, to prayers whispered over newborns at sunrise. It hides in the names of elders, in the blessings spoken when a journey begins, in the words carved into life rituals like wedding, mourning, and sacrifice. Language becomes the loyal soldier guarding identity when all other guards have fallen. And so the tongues of Africa carried the memory of ancient Israel, even when no one recognized what they carried. I saw in a vision a solitary scholar in the quiet of night, tracing linguistic lines across a map with trembling hands. As he compared roots in Hebrew with roots in distant African languages, his breath grew shallow. The patterns lined up like soldiers standing at attention. He whispered to himself that these connections could not be accidents, for no empire could manufacture similarities that reached this deep. What he discovered was not anthropology, it was inheritance. I saw then the battlefield that had once been hidden from sight. For centuries, the enemy of truth tried to sever Israel from Africa in the minds of the world. History books were rewritten, maps redram, faces repainted, narratives restructured. But language resisted. It fought like a quiet warrior, using memory instead of weapons. Every time a mother blessed her child in a rhythm she did not know was ancient Hebrew in shape, truth advanced. Every time a tribe performed a rite that reflected Levitical purity, truth pushed back. Every time a community sang a melody that mirrored the cadence of psalms, truth reclaimed territory. The enemy could silence historians, but he could not silence vocabulary buried in the human heart. He could erase paintings, but he could not erase the patterns in the human tongue. He could destroy monuments, but he could not destroy the rituals carried in daily life. The battlefield belonged to language, because language was older than the lies built to contain it. I saw a young man from the diaspora discovering these linguistic footprints for the first time. He read that Hebrew was part of the Afro-Asiatic linguistic family. At first it was a fact like any other, a line in a book, a classification in a chart, but then he began to hear it differently. He listened to the elders in his family speak proverbs that carried the same structure as ancient Hebrew poetry. He noticed the rhythm of blessings spoken at funerals that matched the cadence of biblical mourning. He heard in the laughter of his grandmother a tone that echoed the ancient pattern of Hebrew idioms. When he realized what he was hearing, he felt something open inside him, like a sealed vault cracking under the weight of revelation. He understood that the tongues of his ancestors had not drifted far from the world of Jacob and Moses. The linguistic distance created by colonial narratives was an illusion. The real distance had never been as vast as the world was taught to believe. And with this understanding came a surge of identity. Not a fragile pride, but a deep recognition that his blood carried memory older than the chains of slavery, older than the borders drawn by colonial hands, older than the textbooks that denied him place in the covenant story. In the battlefield of spiritual warfare, language rose like a sword. It cut through lies, not with power, but with precision. It revealed what had been concealed. It reminded scattered descendants that the breath they used to speak carried the shadow of an ancient covenant. Linguistic evidence stood not as proof alone, but as a call, a summons, a trumpet sounding across time, telling those who had forgotten who they were to rise and reclaim what had been theirs all along. Every vowel became a survivor, every consonant a witness, every shared root a testimony. The languages of Africa did not simply resemble Hebrew. They held hands with it across time, refusing to let go, even when history tried to peel them apart. And now that these patterns are rising again, the world must face the truth. No empire can silence. A people scattered by force kept their inheritance through the sound of their own voices, and no deception could destroy what memory preserved in the hidden chambers of language. Empires rise with iron in their hands and honey on their tongue, speaking of order, while shaping instruments of control. And when faith becomes entangled with their ambitions, truth is the first thing placed upon the altar. The rewriting of sacred history did not begin in the hearts of the oppressed, but in the halls where powerful men pressed quills into parchment, forging new narratives that served crowns instead of covenants. The faces of prophets were not the only things altered. The entire foundation of biblical memory was slowly recarved, reshaped, and reimposed until generations could no longer distinguish the voice of Scripture from the echo of political desire. As I looked upon the chronicles of the past, I saw kings, bishops, and councils sitting together in chambers lit by trembling torches, debating not only doctrine but identity, deciding which stories would be preserved and which truths would be thrust into silence. They called it order. They called it canon. Yet beneath their decisions lay the quiet pulse of convenience. For an Israel connected to Africa stood as a mirror that exposed contradictions in the systems they wished to justify. So the mirror was shattered and its fragments scattered. In the centuries that followed, European empires cast themselves as the natural heirs of the biblical narrative. They painted themselves into the story, not with humility, but with certitude, as if geography, skin, language, and lineage were details that could be erased by decree. Whole continents were redrawn in the minds of believers. Africa, reduced to the margins, its ancient role buried beneath layers of prejudice disguised as theology. They taught that salvation was delivered by pale hands. They taught that prophecy ran along northern rivers rather than desert paths. They taught that divine favor aligned with the expansion of their kingdoms. And the people who bore the marks of ancient Israel, those whose traditions, languages, and histories echoed the covenant, were cast into the shadows where their identity could not threaten the constructed order. I saw the moment when the slave trade began to merge with this theological distortion, forming a weapon of unheard of scale. If those taken from Africa were recognized as connected to Israel, then the moral and spiritual foundations of enslavement would collapse. So doctrines were crafted like chains, doctrines that insisted Africa held no covenant, doctrines that claimed the people torn from their homes were cursed or inferior, doctrines that distorted the story of Ham into a justification for bondage, even though the scripture never spoke such a word. With each deception, the battlefield of truth grew darker, and the enemy of righteousness rejoiced because he understood the power of identity. He knew that a people who forget who they are become pliable, vulnerable, and easy to control. If he could sever their memory, he could sever their hope. If he could alter their past, he could manipulate their future. Yet even as these lies flowed from pulpits and thrones, the truth resisted in silence. I saw hidden manuscripts preserved in lands untouched by Western councils, texts kept in Ethiopia and throughout the Horn, books that held stories the West refused to include. I saw elders guarding scrolls with the devotion of soldiers holding the line at a gate. I saw communities who refused to bow before the new images painted by empire, communities who remembered their lineage even when surrounded by forces that demanded they forget. In a hushed vision, I saw a young priest in medieval Europe painting a mural of biblical scenes. His hand trembled as he dipped his brush into pale pigments. He wanted to paint the figures as he had read them, dark-skinned and desert-worn, but the bishop standing behind him demanded a different portrayal. The priest obeyed, yet his heart fractured, for he knew he was participating in an erasure. When the mural dried, a false memory stood upon the wall. That false memory would travel across continents, shaping imaginations for centuries, teaching millions to see a lie as sacred truth. The battlefield was not fought only with swords. It was fought with art, with scholarship, with sermons, with translations, with silence. Every alteration of history was a strike against a people who were already suffering. And yet, the silence did not last. Beneath the layers of distortion, the ancient truth preserved itself, like embers hidden under ash. Centuries later, when the tide of empire receded, those embers began to glow again. Scholars outside the reach of former colonial powers uncovered maps showing Jewish settlements across Africa. Travelers described tribes observing laws remarkably similar to those in the Torah. Linguists revealed connections between Hebrew and African tongues. Archaeologists unearthed fragments of synagogues in places Europe had declared void of covenant history. Each discovery struck like a lightning bolt against the darkness that had covered the truth. But the greatest revelation was not in artifacts. It was in memory. Elders across Africa spoke of traditions passed down through generations, rituals that matched those of ancient Israel, blessings whose patterns aligned with the priestly language of the Torah, customs too ancient to be borrowings. These memories formed a chorus rising from lands once dismissed by the West, declaring that the covenant story had never belonged to one continent alone. In this unfolding, I saw the enemy tremble, for the structure he built upon falsehood began to crack. When identity awakens, chains lose their power. When truth rises, deception loses its grip. The people who'd been told for generations that their role was marginal started to see that the margin was in fact part of the center. The story once hidden surged to the surface, not as rebellion but as restoration. And so it becomes clear that the rewriting of history was not merely an academic manipulation but a spiritual assault, an intentional strategy to sever a people from their inheritance and blind others to the fullness of the scriptural story. But every lie eventually meets its undoing. The ink that once tried to bury truth now becomes the backdrop against which truth shines brighter. And as this restoration continues, the empire of deception trembles because the world is beginning to remember what was never truly lost. Footsteps echo across forgotten maps when the journey of Israel through Africa begins to surface from beneath centuries of dust. For the evidence of their presence does not rise from imagination, but from the quiet testimony of records left scattered across the corridors of time. Cartographers of the medieval world drew African kingdoms with symbols that hinted at Hebrew lineage, placing marks along the West African coast where communities observed customs traceable to ancient Israel. Arab geographers spoke of tribes who carried names echoing the house of Jacob, tribes whose laws bore the familiar rhythm of the Torah, tribes whose rituals could not have been borrowed from the outside world because they predated the arrival of missionaries and colonizers. As I lingered upon these old manuscripts, their ink fading yet persistent, I felt the weight of a testimony that the world had refused to hear. The maps themselves looked like silent witnesses, standing at the edge of a courtroom, waiting for the judge to acknowledge their relevance. I saw emblems marking Jewish communities deep in the Sahel, descriptions of caravans led by families who identified themselves as descendants of ancient Israelites, reports of merchants who practiced dietary laws and invoked blessings that reflected ancient covenant traditions. These details were not isolated anomalies. They formed a landscape of memory stretching across the continent. Far from foreign lands, African soil had become one of the last guardians of truth. Yet the most powerful testimony did not come from maps, but from the people who carried their identity through centuries of trial. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia stood as an unbroken monument to ancient continuity, preserving traditions that echoed those described in the earliest Hebrew scrolls. Their practices bore the weight of millennia, untouched by the theological reshaping of Europe. Their prayers rose with melodies that belonged to a time before the exile of Judah, before the fires of Rome, before the dispersions that scattered Israel across the world. I saw their elders chanting words that mirrored the cadence of ancient Hebrew, their purity laws preserved with a precision that rivaled those found in the old priestly writings, their festival rites reflecting the rhythms of a calendar rooted in the covenant itself. No empire could erase what these people carried in their bones. Their existence was a challenge to the narrative that sought to sever Israel from Africa, for they stood as living proof that covenant memory had never abandoned the continent. As I traveled the stories of Africa in this inner vision, I saw communities whose oral histories traced their origin to the sons of Jacob. Tribes across Mali, Ghana, and Senegal, whose elders spoke of an ancient migration from the northeast, guided by traditions that only Israel once preserved. One village maintained a sacred ark passed through generations, not a replica created in recent times, but an artifact guarded with the same reverence Israel had shown the Ark of the Covenant in days of old. In the forests of Nigeria, I heard stories of clans who believed their ancestors had once walked alongside the people of Moses, their rituals incorporating the same structure as ancient Hebrew ceremonies, their origin accounts mirroring episodes of the Pentateuch. These were not communities shaped by European teaching. They had kept their identity through their own memory. unbent by foreign interpretation, anchored by traditions that had survived the storms of conquest and dispersion. The deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Africa was not a footnote in the Israelite story. It was a chapter, long and vital, suppressed, but never erased. I saw a lone historian centuries ago writing about Jewish tribes in Timbuktu, describing families who practiced laws that matched Leviticus and Deuteronomy. His writings were dismissed, not because they lacked credibility, but because they threatened a narrative crafted by those who had no interest in restoring truth. The suppression was not academic caution. It was agenda. Empire could tolerate African gold, African labor, African land, but not African lineage tied to the covenant of Scripture. For such a connection would unravel the justification of domination, yet truth is persistent. It rises even when buried under the heaviest stone. As I walked deeper into the vision, I saw caravans crossing the Sahara, their camel bells ringing like distant hymns. Among them travelled scrolls containing fragments of ancient prayers. Merchants recited blessings with rhythms that felt like echoes of Mount Sinai. Women sang lullabies that carried the structure of early Hebrew poetry. Children learned origin stories that matched the wandering of tribes in the wilderness. These fragments were not inventions, they were survivors. Each one was a spark refusing to die in the winds of time. When the world claimed that African Jews were myths, these sparks glowed brighter. When scholars dismissed evidence as coincidence, the patterns persisted. The enemy of truth had hoped to erase this testimony by scattering it across a vast continent, yet the scattering became its preservation. No single empire could collect all the fragments and silence them, and now these fragments rise again, forming a tapestry that reveals what history tried to conceal. Africa holds a record of Israel, not written in stone alone, but in memory, in ritual, in language, in blood. I saw in the final image of this vision a continent standing like a guardian of truth, its people carrying torches of memory through centuries of storm. The time when these torches were ignored has ended. The light they carry now begins to pierce the veils stretched across history, calling the scattered to remember, calling the blind to see, calling the world to recognize that the story of ancient Israel never belonged to one land alone, but walked the breadth of Africa like a river flowing with covenant fire. Stones, remember what the world forgets, and when the earth begins to tremble beneath buried truths. The first witnesses to rise are the artifacts left behind by hands long turned to dust. In the quiet of forgotten deserts and abandoned ruins, inscriptions carved in ancient Hebrew emerge from the soil, like voices crying out in a courtroom where history has been forced to plead its case. These remnants do not shout, they do not argue, they stand in silence, yet their silence is sharper than any accusation spoken aloud. I saw tablets unearthed in the sands of Egypt, their letters shaped in the angles of early Hebrew, untouched by European influence, untouched by the long shadow of colonial imagination. Their edges wore the scars of wind and age, but their testimony remained intact, declaring that the presence of Israel in Africa was not a curiosity, but a reality known to ancient generations. Farther south, in lands now called Sudan, fragments of stone carried inscriptions marking the prayers of a forgotten community. These stones bore the weight of memory, like soldiers standing their final watch, refusing to abandon their post, even when the world denied their existence. As I walked deeper into this vision, I saw a ruined structure half claimed by the desert, its foundation whispering of a synagogue that had stood centuries before Europe ever painted its first whitewashed prophet. The layout reflected the same architectural pattern found in early Israelite worship spaces, the same alignment with the heavens, the same reverence for sacred light. This was not the invention of outsiders. It was the remnant of a people who held the covenant close, even as empires rose and fell around them. In the highlands of Ethiopia, ancient scrolls rested beneath layers of cloth in the hands of priests whose families had safeguarded them for generations. These scrolls carried chants that echoed the cadence of ancient Hebrew, prayers that reflected the rhythms of the Torah, language that aligned with the covenant long before Europe claimed ownership of theology. Scholars attempted to dismiss these scrolls as anomalies, yet their dismissal only revealed their fear. If these scrolls were acknowledged, they would tear holes in the narrative carefully woven by centuries of political theology. The artifacts did not bend to the opinions of scholars. They stood like pillars, older than the lies that tried to cover them. I saw a mosaic uncovered in the ruins of an ancient town near the Mediterranean coast. The figures in the artwork bore skin darkened by the sun, eyes shaped by the harsh beauty of desert life, hair curled like the people who dwelled in northeastern Africa. These details were not accidents. Artists paint what they see, not what later empires want them to preserve. The more mosaics discovered, the clearer the pattern became. Biblical figures, when portrayed by ancient hands, did not resemble the pale images that would later fill European cathedrals. They reflected the faces of people shaped by African and Near Eastern sun. This truth did not require debate. It required only eyes willing to see. But the world had been trained to look away. I saw a chamber filled with European paintings, each one a monument to an illusion, each one crafted to impose a version of history that never existed. These paintings became weapons more powerful than swords, shaping imaginations across continents. Yet the ancient mosaics, older and more honest, stood like warriors, refusing to retreat. Their colors may have faded, but their message had not. I saw archaeologists in the modern age brushing away sand from a stone inscription in West Africa, the letters forming phrases that mirrored early Hebrew poetry. Their excitement flickered, but so did fear, for they knew that if this evidence reached the mainstream, it would shift the landscape of biblical scholarship like an earthquake. Some suppressed the findings, some buried them in archives, some labeled them as curiosities, but truth has a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks. And as these discoveries multiplied, the cracks turned into fractures across the wall of deception. Each artifact rose like a trumpet blast. Each inscription broke another layer of falsehood. Each mosaic became a blade cutting through centuries of distortion. In a vision, I saw the artifacts assemble themselves like an army, standing shoulder to shoulder on a battlefield lit by the dim glow of dawn. Their message was unspoken yet unmistakable. We were here. We have always been here. No empire can erase us. I saw the ground itself testify. Layers of soil revealed traces of ritual practices matching those in the Torah. Ancient altars aligned with the same patterns used by early Israel, burial customs identical to those of the covenant people. None of these discoveries were influenced by Europe. They predated every European revision. They stood outside the reach of those who tried to reshape the story. The earth, the stones, the ruins, the mosaics, all rose like witnesses, summoned by a divine decree. They did not seek permission to speak. They simply spoke, and because they spoke without human permission, their testimony cut deeper than any scholar's argument. Those who wish to hide them realize too late that truth buried deep becomes truth impossible to extinguish. The deepest revelation came at the end of the vision. I saw a person walking through a silent museum, unaware that the artifacts around them were awakening as they passed a mosaic. Its colors seemed to glimmer as they approached a stone inscription. The letters seemed to pulse with invisible fire. Though the person did not hear it with their ears, their spirit heard a whisper rising from every artifact in the room. Remember. It was not a command to recall history. It was a call to reclaim identity, to reclaim what had been taken, to reclaim what had been denied. The artifacts were not merely evidence. They were instruments of awakening. They were weapons in the war for truth. And now that they have risen, the world must reckon with the story they have guarded in silence for centuries. Rituals breathe long after empires fade. And when customs survive the crushing weight of exile, they reveal a lineage stronger than chains, stronger than borders, stronger than centuries of forgetting. In the lands where ancient memory still flickers like a hidden flame, I saw traditions carried with the quiet dignity of warriors guarding sacred ground. These customs were not fragile ornaments, but weapons forged in the furnaces of history. Each one a shield against erasure. Each one a reminder of a covenant that refused to die. Across the highlands of Ethiopia, in villages tucked into rugged mountains, I saw families observing purity laws that matched the patterns of ancient Israel. They washed their hands before meals with a reverence that mirrored priestly instructions. They separated milk from meat with a discipline not learned from any modern teaching, but inherited from ancestors who preserved these laws long before European theologians debated them. Their Sabbath rested upon them like a mantle from another age. A stillness that hummed with ancient authority. Children learned the rhythm of candlelight. Elders recited blessings in cadences that echoed the structure of early Hebrew prayers. Nothing about these rituals belonged to coincidence. They were remnants of a story preserved in flesh beyond Ethiopia, in the southern lands, where the hills roll into wide plains. I saw the Lemba people guard their customs like a fortress. They refused pork not because of influence from recent teachers, but because their fathers and their fathers' fathers had forbidden it. They practiced circumcision on the 8th day, a detail too precise and too ancient to be accidental. Their burial rites mirrored those described in the Torah. Their dietary laws held the same boundaries drawn by Levitical instruction. And when the world questioned their identity, the patterns in their blood answered. Men among them carried a genetic signature found among ancient Israelite priests, a marker passed only through unbroken lineage. Blood confirmed what ritual had already declared. Their identity did not need the permission of scholars. It had been carved in them like an inscription no empire could erase. In Ghana, the Sefwi people preserved mysteries that whispered of an older origin. They kept a sacred day of rest aligned with the biblical Sabbath. They practiced purification rituals at dawn and dusk. They observed festivals matching seasons marked in the Hebrew calendar. These practices existed long before outside religions touched their shores. No missionary taught them. No colonial decree shaped them. Their customs carried the weight of memory older than conquest. When I stood among their ceremonies in this inner vision, I felt as though I were witnessing a distant echo of Sinai, softened only by time, but not diminished in power. In Nigeria, through dense forests and villages threaded with ancient paths, I encountered clans whose traditions reflected the inner architecture of covenant life. Their naming rituals aligned with Hebrew patterns. Their marriage rites mirrored those found among early Israel. Their songs carry the same rising and falling cadence found in Psalms, as though the poetry of David had traveled through storms and deserts to rest in their voices. They did not know the source. They simply lived what had been handed down. Across Cameroon and the heartlands of West Africa, I saw sacrifices performed with gestures matching those of ancient Israel. Altars constructed with the same design, prayers spoken with the same upward motion of hands, blessings pronounced with the same solemnity. These rituals were not imported fragments. They were ancestral memories, resisting extinction. It became clear that rituals were the strongest guardians of identity, for even when history was twisted, even when images were painted over, even when scholars dismissed the truth, ritual enduret, a community that remembers how to worship remembers who they are. Every time a goat was sacrificed with the precision described in ancient law, every time an elder blessed a child with a formula preserved by centuries of breath, every time a household kept the Sabbath even in lands where no one else understood it. Identity declared itself without words. Ritual became a fortress. Ritual became armor. Ritual became a declaration of war against the silence imposed by empire. I saw in a vision a family gathered in a small hut lit by a single flame. The mother prepared food according to dietary laws she inherited, not from missionaries, but from her own lineage. The father recited blessings that matched the syntax of ancient Hebrew. The children repeated phrases they did not know were fragments of a covenant older than the nation they lived in. These acts were simple, yet each one struck like a hammer against the wall of deception built by centuries of foreign influence. I saw elders from dispersed tribes meeting for the first time after generations of separation. They spoke different languages, lived under different flags, held different names. Yet when they performed certain rituals, their movements aligned like dancers trained by the same invisible master. Their hands turned in the same way. Their prayers rose in the same rhythm. Their purification rites matched detail for detail. They were strangers who remembered the same forgotten thing. Such unity could not be staged. It was inheritance. Across the continent, these customs formed constellations of identity. No empire connected them. No missionary coordinated them. No political system preserved them. They survived because they were carried in the marrow of a scattered people. And then the realization struck like a trumpet blast. Rituals were the last line of defense against erasure. The silent war waged by a people whose identity had been targeted for destruction. These customs were not primitive. They were ancient strategies of survival. Every household that kept the Sabbath acted as a soldier defending the memory of Israel. Every family that practiced dietary law strengthened the chain, linking them to ancestors thousands of years past. Every blessing whispered over a child was an arrow fired into the darkness that tried to swallow truth. Ritual had become the battlefield where identity refused to die. And now, as these traditions rise again in the consciousness of the world, they reveal the magnitude of what has been preserved. The story hidden by empires lies intact beneath the surface. It survived because ritual carried it like a torch through centuries of night. Now the torch is visible again, calling the scattered to remember the covenant etched into their very way of life. Signals stir across the horizon of spiritual time when the prophetic call begins to awaken those who once walked in the shadow of exile. For prophecy moves like a tide that cannot be stopped, rising slowly at first, then swelling with force when the appointed hour arrives. The first tremor of this awakening appears not in grand events but in quiet recognition, a moment when scattered hearts begin to sense that something ancient is calling them back from the long night of forgetting. The words of Isaiah unfold like a banner lifted in the wind, declaring that the Lord will stretch out his hand a second time to recover the remnant of his people from every land where they were scattered. This is not the whisper of metaphor. It is a divine operation, a strategic recovery, a battle plan written before the foundations of nations were laid. The scattered are not merely individuals. They are fragments of a once unified people whose identity was battered by empire, captivity, and the manipulation of history. Yet prophecy holds them in place like stars bound to a constellation, even when separated by great distance. When the awakening begins, it does not ask for permission from the world. It rises with the authority of a commander calling soldiers back to formation. I saw men and women across the diaspora feel a stirring in their spirit, as if an unseen hand brushed against the door of their memory. Some felt it while reading scripture that suddenly seemed to speak directly to them. Others felt it while hearing ancient music that resonated with a familiarity they could not explain. Some felt it during moments of struggle, when prayers flowed from their lips in rhythms older than the languages they spoke. In each person, the awakening manifested like a spark falling upon dry ground, small at first, but capable of igniting an entire forest. I saw communities scattered across continents begin to notice patterns they had never seen before. A tradition their elders practiced resembled a law described in the Torah. A melody in their worship carried the cadence of ancient Hebrew lament. A proverb spoken by an ancestor mirrored a verse found in scripture. These realizations were not random. They were signals. They were the early footsteps of prophecy drawing near. The awakening expanded like a tide, pulling back the veil of centuries. I saw families in the Caribbean uncover oral histories that spoke of ancestors practicing customs resembling those of Israel. I saw communities in the Americas experiencing dreams in which they walked through desert landscapes they had never visited, as though the memory of their ancestors rose within them. I saw individuals who had grown distant from their faith suddenly feeling drawn to the stories of the Old Testament, feeling as if those stories were somehow their own. This awakening did not create arrogance, it created clarity. It did not divide, it instructed, it did not inflate pride, it restored belonging as prophecy stood. I saw a battlefield forming not of violence, but of identity. The enemy, who once erased faces and altered history, recognized the danger of awakening. If the scattered remembered who they were, the lies woven through centuries would unravel. So he attempted to confuse, distract, distort. He whispered that identity did not matter, that history was irrelevant, that lineage had no place in modern faith. But his whispers could not drown the sound of prophecy rising like a storm. The awakening carried the same force that once brought Israel out of Egypt, the same urgency that once called dry bones to rise in the vision of Ezekiel. It was not a human movement. It was divine. In another vision, I saw a valley lined with the shadows of those who had forgotten their origin. When the wind of awakening passed through, their shadows lengthened, then took form, then rose like an army assembled by the breath of God. These were not warriors seeking conquest. They were guardians of memory returning to their rightful place. They marched with purpose, not to claim superiority, but to reclaim truth. I saw the scattered gathering not in one physical place, but in unity of understanding. People across nations began to recognize the pattern of their exile and the calling of their return. They felt the scriptures open themselves in new ways. They saw their suffering reflected in the warnings of Deuteronomy. They saw their endurance reflected in the Psalms. They saw their resilience reflected in the prophets who cried for justice in the face of oppression. And slowly, truth knitted itself back together from fragments long abandoned. Prophecy spoke again, reminding the scattered that the covenant was not destroyed by dispersion, only hidden. I saw elders in distant lands teach younger generations the rituals that had been preserved. I saw younger people rise with fire in their hearts, determined to uncover the history denied to their ancestors. I saw healers, prophets, teachers, and warriors emerging from among the scattered, each carrying a piece of the calling, each walking in the authority of restored identity, and through it all, the thread of prophecy held them together. From the four corners of the earth, the scattered were being called not to abandon their present home, but to awaken to their ancient roots, to reclaim the purpose engraved upon their lineage, to stand as witnesses to the truth. Empires could not bury. The time of forgetting is ending. The time of remembrance has begun. The awakening is not a rumor. It is a summons. It is the moment when those once broken by exile rise as bearers of a story older than nations, a story that survived fire, chains, and deception. Now the scattered gather again, not by force, but by truth, not by conquest, but by prophecy, not by pride, but by purpose. And as they rise, the world begins to tremble. For a people who finally remember who they are cannot be silenced again. Truth gathers like a storm when the final veil begins to fall. And every fragment uncovered across this journey stands together now like an army aligned for battle. Scripture, language, ritual, archaeology, migration, prophecy, each piece once scattered now returns to its place in a design that can no longer be denied. The story that empire tried to erase rises with a clarity that cuts through centuries of distortion, revealing that identity was never lost, only buried beneath layers of fear, politics, and ambition. As the landscape of deception trembles, a new horizon emerges, not of novelty but of restoration. The evidence from every corner of history speaks with one unified voice, declaring that the covenant story is broader, deeper, and more diverse than the world was allowed to see. The awakening of the scattered is not a rebellion, it is a return. It is the moment when truth calls its children back from the margins, when hidden memory breaks through like dawn after the longest night. This awakening does not erase others from the story. It restores those who were pushed out of it, and in doing so, brings the entire tapestry of Scripture into sharper, more radiant color. I saw in a final vision the battlefield of this age, not a place of swords and blood, but of narratives, identities, and spiritual inheritance. The enemy who once reshaped images and rewrote histories now trembles because the tools he used have begun to fail. Chains forged from lies fall apart when confronted by truth. Illusions lose their power when exposed to light. Entire generations who once walked in the fog of borrowed identity begin to rise with the authority of those who finally see their reflection in the sacred story. And as they rise, a healing begins to sweep across the wounds carved by slavery, exile, colonization, and erasure. The healing does not erase the pain, it claims victory over it. Those who were once told they were outsiders to the covenant now stand with the confidence of heirs returning to a home their ancestors never abandoned, only had stolen from them. In this moment, the story reaches its highest point. For what began as the unveiling of suppressed history becomes the forging of a new generation of warriors not armed with violence but with truth, discipline and spiritual fire. A people awakened to their identity becomes a people impossible to control. A people who remember their lineage become a people who stand immovable against deception. A people restored to their place in the narrative become defenders of truth in an age built on illusion. I saw these awakened ones standing like sentinels across nations, guarding the gates of memory, teaching their children what was denied to them, reclaiming rituals once mocked or forgotten, walking with the dignity of those who know they carry a covenant older than empire. I saw them reading scripture with new eyes, no longer as outsiders borrowing another nation's story, but as participants reclaiming their ancestral inheritance. And in this rising, a call goes forth, a call that echoes through the soul like a trumpet blast. Step into the truth you have now seen. Do not allow the weight of old deceptions to settle upon you again. Examine every image placed before you. Question every narrative handed down by those who benefited from your silence. Stand guard over your mind, your faith, your memory. This is the trial set before you. The enemy will not surrender territory without resistance. But the ground you reclaim through truth becomes ground. Your children will never lose. Lift your voice, lift your understanding, lift your identity. Declare that the story will no longer be rewritten at your expense. Walk as one who stands in the full armor of truth, carrying the fire of a heritage restored by the hand of God.